So, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. Um, I want to first introduce myself. For those of you who don't know, I'm Donna Fraser, Senior Vice President of Privacy Initiatives here at BBB National Programs. And today I'm really happy to welcome Alex Greenstein, the Director of Data Privacy Framework for the Department of Commerce. This is, I think, a great way to kick off the new year, a great way to kick off Data Privacy Week. So, Alex, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure to be here with you all.
Thank you. So, a quick overview of our agenda today. We're going to talk about transatlantic data flows. Obviously, we're going to get into some details on the data privacy framework, DPF, as we all affectionately call it, and specifically kind of what's new since it came online, breaking down the value proposition of that, and also the role of independent recourse mechanisms, which BBB National Programs is. So, for those of you who are not familiar with who we are, BBB National Programs, we are a self regulatory body, we're a nonprofit organization. Here in our famous pinwheel, you can see that we have over 20 self regulatory and co regulatory programs in the advertising, privacy, and dispute resolution spaces. Um, so, let's get into today's conversation. And first, let's take a look at kind of the big picture and where data flows were in 2023. I think it was a very jarring year for companies last year. They were slow to, it seemed, to adopt or really deal with international data transfers. And I think that there were different priorities for companies. Obviously, AI was a huge hot button issue for companies. And Data Privacy Framework, DPF, came online in July. So, kind of halfway into the year. And I think companies were still a little bit on pause, trying to figure out where are their priorities, where are their next steps, where are they going to put their money and all of their resources. If you take a look at this kind of governance report that we've given kind of a snapshot of, it kind of gives you some, I think, important data points. So I think even though most sectors outside the tech and telecom sector did not directly prioritize international data transfers, it seems that it did take second place. I think AI governance took a front seat, continues to take a front seat. But the larger companies, especially kind of in the $1 billion revenue range, were more likely to find international data transfers a top five privacy priority for them. Smaller companies are not prioritizing it the same way, and I'm sure that there are a multitude of reasons why. But Alex, I'd be curious to hear any kind of guidance or advice that you would give to companies about where they should be ranking these international data flows and transfers among their list of priorities for this year.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And definitely let me say, we really sincerely appreciate the partnership that BBB has had with us on the DPF and the Privacy Shield before. But yeah, I definitely think that sort of data flows and data privacy compliance is something that companies need to be thinking about. I mean, this is a significant sort of place where you have sort of probably some compliance obligations. If you're doing business that touches Europe in some way, you're probably have some obligations under the General Data Protection Regulation, the EU's major privacy law. And that's something I think that companies of all sizes need to be thinking about. And so that definitely sort of that figure you cited about sort of the big companies still focusing very much on international transfers and smaller companies thinking about it less. I think that sort of this is something that sort of small and medium enterprises do need to keep in mind, because you may not be doing sort of a huge amount of business with Europe, or maybe it is sort of a more an expansion area for you, but you probably are going to have these obligations, and the data privacy framework is a affordable, scalable way to comply with those obligations.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think that's I think sort of why this needs to be on people's radar screen and something that folks should be focusing on, because also it's, yeah.
So when you are talking to companies about um, when data privacy framework came online, and obviously, as you know better than than most, 2+ years companies were trying to figure out how do we navigate this in a post Schrems 2 world. Um, you know, what do you say to companies to encourage them, right? How do you get people past the trepidation that, there was a lot of work put into this. There's a lot of staying power here. What advice do you give to companies with regards to kind of having spent the last couple of years operating under that regime and now shifting over?
Yeah, I think the thing is, like, what we say is, and I say this to companies, I mean, huge thanks to the ones who did sort of stick with sort of the privacy shield during that difficult time when we were following Schrems too. And yeah, there was definitely an all hands on deck effort sort of in Washington as well as in Brussels to find a solution because there really isn't an option there to have sort of like transatlantic data flows brought into question or sort of like companies not being able to move data across the Atlantic. I mean, this underpins sort of the 7.1 trillion transatlantic economy between the United States and the EU. And then also, I mean, it underpins like $450 billion. That's sort of the
Right.
estimate of digital trade between the US and the EU. And I mean, Schrems threatens sort of all data transfers, not just sort of those under privacy shield. So this was
Right.
something that we had to do in order to preserve all data transfers.
Hmm.
It was also a little bit sort of perverse because the privacy shield and the DPF now are primarily used by small and medium enterprises
Right.
because it is a more accessible means of compliance with sort of their GDPR transfer requirements.
Hmm.
Um, but definitely during that sort of interim period, companies had a lot harder time complying with their obligations under the GDPR for data transfers. And I think you did see a lot of companies had to retool in order to use the standard contractual clauses or
Hmm.
binding corporate rules or other mechanisms
Hmm.
um, to cover their data transfers.
Right.
But those also are a lot more expensive. I
Hmm.
mean, and that is a burden on companies. I mean, having to
Right.
sort of pay tens of thousands of dollars to get your sort of standard contractual clauses put into place. It's also sort of a little bit more cumbersome than the DPF, and so that's was a burden for small and medium enterprises that we're hoping that the DPF helps alleviate. And so we're really happy that this is sort of back in force now with sort of like the full faith and credit of the United States government and the European Union behind it. And we
Right.
really have tried to sort of make this a deal that can withstand legal challenge.
Hmm.
And we made some significant changes to address all the concerns raised by the Schrems 2 decision. And this is something that we are, prepared to defend against future legal challenges. And
Right.
so I think companies should feel that they can use this with assurance
Hmm.
um, and take advantage of it because it can offer them a significantly more affordable means to uh, comply with to transfer data from the European Union to the United States in compliance with EU privacy law.
Right. So you segued nicely into kind of the next talking point here, which is President Biden's executive order, right? And the power and authority that has been granted to the Department of Commerce. So looking at this bigger picture, President Biden's executive order really calls out strengthening American leadership abroad and has put the Department of Commerce in charge of leading a plan for global engagement. And on top of that, the FTC just announced its plan to take a front seat on the global nature of cross-border privacy rules program. Obviously, another signal that data transfers will be an important topic, for the year ahead. So, can you share how the Department of Commerce is kind of prepping to answer the president's executive order? What are you intending to do?
No, yeah, definitely. I'm not sort of like front and center on sort of like the AI issues. I sort of work on sort of the EU data flows issues, but this is definitely something that sort of we are like plugged into and sort of definitely are very supportive of. And commerce is definitely going to be playing a leading role in sort of implementing that executive order and leading sort of and playing a leading role in the administration's approach to ensuring that there is safe, secure, and trustworthy AI and promoting AI innovation. And a key element of sort of being able to sort of do that AI innovation is being able to have access to data. And so data flows are sort of, I think, it's almost like sort of a precondition for being able to do these sort of incredible things with AI is being able to actually transfer data and be able to sort of use it in a way that is consistent with sort of privacy protections. And
Hmm.
so that's something we're definitely looking at. And sort of so our job is also to is mainly I guess to enable sort of those data transfers that will help companies take advantage of and develop these AI technologies. And then certainly, I mean, there is work ongoing in a number of lanes about sort of looking at um, what AI means for sort of privacy, how to ensure that AI development is done in a manner that protects the provides for safety and security and protects Americans' privacy, advances sort of equity and civil rights, and
Hmm.
sort of and all of those sort of are have a hook in sort of privacy policy and sort of also in um, compliance with sort of foreign privacy legislation as well.
Right.
Um, and so also, we're tracking very closely as well, sort of discussions around domestic privacy legislation and sort of what that would, I mean, certainly that's good in and of itself, but also how that would work with the data privacy framework and sort of making sure that, that is sort of deconflicted with sort of companies' obligations under the DPF and EU law.
Right. Right.
So
I
there's
mean,
a lot of moving pieces right now.
yeah. Yeah, but I think look, I think it's all good for the United States. It's good for commerce. It's good for as we pointed out, the small and medium sized businesses who I think are struggling with trying to figure out how to maintain their businesses overseas and engage with their ex-US customers. And I think in light of all the talk that we saw in 2023, and of course is going to continue this year, and I think. What we know about DPF is that AI can operate under DPF, right? This is agnostic to technology, right? It's
Yeah.
going to grow with technology. So I think that that's something that people can have great comfort
Yeah, I'd
with.
say AI basically makes it more important that you would actually be looking at sort of and putting in place sort of strong privacy policies.
Right.
I mean, because it basically means you need to have sort of that compliance in place. And I guess one thing I would say for sort of companies, and the way I think about it is that the DPF can be a very good sort of basis and starting point for your
Hmm.
privacy compliance. I mean, in sort of like a world where there's a lot of compliance burdens and you're having to deal with a lot of sort of different moving uh,
Right.
regulatory sort of legislation and sort of different
Hmm.
pictures, what's coming out of Europe, what's coming out of Congress potentially. Um, Having sort of a principles based approach, sort of like the DPF, can
Hmm.
provide a strong basis for your privacy and sort of regulatory compliance policy. I mean,
Right.
because a lot of things that you have to do for the DPF will help you to comply with sort of other obligations that come up down the line.
Right. I think we've talked about this, and I'm sure you've said this as well. It's one of the tools in the toolbox for companies, right? Having more than one, having belts and suspenders can't hurt. But I think this is, DPF provides a great foundation and a good starting point for companies.
Yeah, and it's
Um,
also sort of an umbrella approach to it because it
right.
covers sort of all of your transfers, all of your sort of lines of business, rather than sort of being particularized to sort of a specific transfer
Hmm.
or series of transfers.
Right. So I'm going to turn it over to you. I know that you have the next few slides that you wanted to talk through.
Great, yes. So yes, so DPF program. So yes, the data privacy framework, what we've worked on for the last um, number of years now, sort of following the Schrems 2 decision that invalidated the previous Privacy Shield framework that we put in place. And so the significant development there really was we and the EU committed together strongly to address the concerns raised by the Schrems 2 decision. This was sort of the challenge that Max Schrems brought against sort of the Privacy Shield framework, and that highlighted some concerns about sort of the necessity and proportionality of U.S. Government access to data and surveillance, as well as the availability of redress. And so that resulted in a number of years of discussions with the EU, and that ended up with the Executive Order 14086 on enhancing safeguards for U.S. signals intelligence, which really made some groundbreaking commitments um, to address the concerns raised by the Schrems Court. And that specifically, that includes language on um, necessity and proportionality of when the U.S. government does surveillance and sort of for what purposes, as well as establishing sort of a two-layer redress system that really does provide ultimately gives sort of EU individuals access to the data privacy review court over at the Department of Justice, which is sort of an unprecedented step that really I think demonstrates the level of commitment the U.S. government has to this program and to sort of transatlantic data transfers and sort of the importance we place on this, and also the depth of the relationship between the United States and the European Union. Um, so yeah, we definitely, since we launched the DPF in July, we've seen significant uptake. I think right now we are um, almost at 2,700 companies participating. And we've definitely sort of, and that continues to be primarily driven by small and medium enterprises. I think we're upwards of 70% or maybe even 75% SMEs. And that's because, I mean, this is sort of a more affordable and more approachable and easily implemented means of compliance with the GDPR transfer obligations. We're also looking at expanding the program and continuing to bring new partners into it. In October, we launched the UK extension to the DPF, and that enables companies to um, almost seamlessly sort of cover transfers of data from the United Kingdom to the United States while maintaining sort of their same um, policies and procedures under the DPF. And so that
Right.
really
So I
adds
think
an
so
additional benefit.
right. So for clarity there, for those who don't really understand, right, under Brexit, once Brexit
Yes.
happened, the UK was no longer covered by the agreement between the US and the EU.
Yeah.
So they have their own little regime now.
Yes, and so this sort of in the UK sort of found if companies comply with sort of the um, data privacy framework and sort of put those policies in place and apply them to UK individuals, they found that adequate for the purposes of the UK's data privacy law. And so that enables companies to use that mechanism to transfer data from the United Kingdom to the United States. And then we're also working with the Swiss administration right now to put in place the Swiss US data privacy framework. And the sort of will we had under Privacy Shield, we also had sort of the Swiss US Privacy Shield, and we are working to sort of replicate that under the data privacy framework. And so that's um, and then also we are sort of looking at in 2024 continuing to publicize the data privacy framework and identifying really what are barriers to companies being able to use it, and trying to identify sort of companies who could be benefiting from this
Hmm.
and making it more accessible to them. And also we're working with partners such as BBB to publicize this and grow participation in providing this valuable service to U.S. companies. Issues, I mean, we definitely have recently we did some major updates to the back end of our website, and I think companies may have seen that they had to revalidate their sort of existing accounts under the new platform. Um, Definitely, I can sort of we're prepared to sort of provide guidance on that.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, we definitely sort of look for things in the QA about that. But yeah, no, we're definitely very excited to have this sort of back in force and being able to provide the service. So, what do companies need to do in order to join the DPF? Um, so, here on the slide, that sort of provides the process. We also know, I mean, this is sort of voluntary. Companies are under no obligation to do this. They can certainly, they should work with their counsel to figure out what is the best approach to compliance for them.
Hmm.
But I mean, I would say that companies should strongly consider the DPF because it is it provides sort of a um, affordable, approachable, and sort of scalable approach to data transfers, which may end up being sort of a better fit for many companies than the standard contractual clauses, which
Right.
requires a lot more legal expenses for implementing it. And also, I'd say that like I know companies should also consider the DPF because it's a recognized sort of it provides something of like a good housekeeping seal of approval. It represents
Mhm.
certain best practices, and I think that is appreciated. And sort of like and it helps companies give customers um, an understanding and a sense that they are going to abide by certain best practices, and that's particularly important in Europe, where I think there are some misperceptions about sort of the U.S. being sort of this privacy um, place where sort of there's less focus on that, and it allows companies to say that they do abide by these commitments,
Mhm.
and that companies' data and the person's data will be protected adequately. Um, and so, yeah, the other like aspect I should note here is that it is important also for companies to um, make sure that they actually are eligible to participate. That is
Mhm.
one thing we do actually encounter a decent amount. Is that unfortunately we can't. Companies have to fall under the Federal Trade Commission or Department of Transportation's jurisdiction for enforcement, and so unfortunately that excludes nonprofits,
Right.
and so they have to be. And so that is something we've sort of talked about looking into down the road. I mean, is there a way to cover that? But for right now, companies would need to verify that they're eligible for the
Mhm.
DPF. Um, so once you've sort of gone through the process sort of on the website, organizations do need to sort of develop a privacy policy that complies with sort of the data privacy framework and provides the basically conforms to the DPF principles, which you can look on our website, and they provide and details sort of what companies should be doing in terms of providing um, notice and choice and sort of all the like things you would expect there. Um, and then also sort of like providing a link to sort of like that privacy policy and making it available. And then also then that gets to sort of the part where BBB fits into it. It's
Right.
electing for a putting in place an independent recourse mechanism for to cover the personal data transferred. And that sort of is an obligation under the recourse enforcement and liability principle. They have to like put that in place. And so companies should and have an obligation to take complaints on their own from individuals who are like using their services, but also they, under the terms of our agreement with the EU, have to put in place a independent redress mechanism. That's sort of
Mhm.
a where they provide sort of an alternative like approach for like someone else that they can go to if they have complaints about how their data has been handled or sort of whether or not if there's a dispute. And
Right.
BBB is like provided that and is a um, yeah good partner for the DPF in that regard.
Mhm.
Um, um, and so then yes, you have like also to ensure that you have a verification mechanism in place. Um, we provide guidance on sort of how to do that and who can like verify sort of um, your policies and procedures are implemented as represented, and then identifying a point of contact for us to like deal with about sort of questions around sort of your certification and recertification, and who would be handling complaints and access requests from individuals, and then finally, or not finally, um, yeah, submitting the self certification to our team at the Department of Commerce, who will review it and then sort of finalize your certification. Um,
So how long is that process? How what should businesses expect when they submit their application? How long is that process?
I mean, it depends. I mean, it depends on sort of like how prepared they are,
Mhm.
what they already have in place in terms of sort of a privacy policy, what changes need to be made to it, and then also sort of like how much time they have to devote to sort of that. I mean, it varies widely, so I can't really give sort of like a good estimate. I mean, it could
Mhm.
be sort of like a couple of weeks, but it also can like stretch out to like a couple of months if there needs to be like a lot of back and forth and about sort of what your privacy policy looks like and sort of what changes you need to make there. And I think a lot of it also is deal with um, yeah, how quickly folks get back in touch with us about sort of making those
Right.
changes. And so, but yeah, we have sort of a team who does sort of like, handle this and tries to sort of like, move it along as quickly as possible. But
Right. Yeah. And I know that when companies come to us for their IRM services, we kind of walk them through and help explain to them everything they need in order to do the self certification, right? So that they are prepared and that they can move this pretty smoothly and
yeah,
quickly.
and that's an important part of it, I think, is making sure that companies do understand sort of their obligations
Hmm.
under, the program, because
Hmm.
these are sort of like, pretty serious commitments that they're making.
Right.
And it's backed up by enforcement by the Federal Trade Commission. And we don't
Hmm.
want sort of companies entering into this and sort of not being prepared to respond to sort of complaints from individuals and not putting in place the right protections and not being aware of sort of obligations that they've signed up
Hmm.
for. And also, we'll say that, like, yeah, this is sort of a serious, this isn't just sort of a rubber stamp. And that's also
That's
sort of
right.
something that we sort of, because the integrity of the program is very important to us and to our partners in Europe, who also pay
Hmm.
very close attention to this. And so that's why we have that segues into what the oversight that the Department of Commerce has over
Hmm.
this program. And
Hmm.
so we definitely do sort of do spot checks of, like, companies' privacy policies to make sure that things haven't changed and that sort of those commitments and the things that they are supposed to be including in the privacy policy remain there, and that sort of they aren't changing the terms of the deal with their customers. Also, that sort of like individuals have access to a point of contact for complaints, and if they want to request deletion or access to their data,
Hmm.
adherence to sort of the notice principle, and sort of then also making sure that they maintain sort of availability of their independent recourse mechanism, as well as binding uh, alternative dispute resolution. We
Right.
also do sort of check for adverse publicly available information about companies. If there's a data breach or some other sort of like, litigation regarding a company and sort of their privacy policies and their privacy actions, um, yeah, we'll sort of look into that and see whether how does that comport with their commitments under the data
Hmm.
privacy framework. And then finally, like, sending, yeah, and if it rises to sort of that level of credibility, then we'll also sort of send out a questionnaire to sort of the company asking, um, does this negatively impact your ability to participate in the data privacy framework? How does this comply with sort of the, for instance, like, the security obligations under the DPF, and like how's that
Hmm.
done? And so, yeah, and that is important because we do need to be able to sort of demonstrate that these commitments are real and companies are really complying with them. And, and I think it is recognized in Europe by privacy authorities in Europe, as well as the European Commission, that um, companies' commitments under the DPF are quite real and provide sort of a real strong level of protection for EU individuals. And I think
Right.
that sort of circles back to sort of what I was saying earlier about this being sort of a something companies can point to and be able to reassure their customers that no, I have to comply with sort of these privacy with these rules under the DPF, and that provides a strong level of protection for you as a customer.
Right,
Um,
right. And to your point about not rubber stamping, I know over the years, few and far between, but we have seen the FTC bring forth a few cases against companies who have falsely claimed to be complying, right, to be part of Privacy Shield before DPF, and making statements in their privacy policies that were
mhm.
false. So there are
Yeah.
consequences.
Well, and also, the FTC has also brought legal action against companies who, yeah, putting aside sort of the companies who are like, faking it and just claiming that they were part of like a
Hmm.
privacy shield, but weren't actually doing any of the things they were supposed to do. You actually had also cases where the FTC would sort of independently identify companies who had had sort of major data breaches or were like not adequately protecting the personal information of individuals. And if they were signed up under the Privacy Shield, they would also bring that case about sort of companies violating sort of like those commitments. And so the FTC can enforce against that and does so quite strongly. And so that really is sort of should be a strong motivation for companies to fully comply with what they're committing to.
Mhm.
And so yes, we also do sort of pursue quite rigorously sort of working to prevent sort of false claims, and then also sort of identifying companies who are sort of falsely claiming that they're participating in the framework, and then referring that to the Federal Trade Commission for enforcement.
Right.
And that's another thing I think that is like recognized sort of in Europe, that the FTC's enforcement of Privacy Shield before it, and now the DPF is quite strong and provides sort of a high level of assurance that companies will sort of comply with these obligations, and that protects individuals and should give customers in Europe a sense of security.
I mean, can this program exist? Could Privacy Shield and DPF now moving forward exist without the element of IRM, right? I think we'll do a little bit of a deeper dive as we talk about this in a couple of minutes. But the value and how important the IRM is to this entire process. Can you speak a little bit to
Oh,
that?
no, the IRM is an entirely vital aspect of this because, I mean, I think that was one of the things. I mean, there's a reason why this has been included in sort of Privacy Shield, and before that in sort of Safe Harbor, is that sort of I think there is a sense in Europe that um, individuals need to have an impartial place they can go to
Mhm.
resolve complaints. And certainly, like, yes, like, they can go to the company in the first instance, and like, hopefully, it can be resolved at that point, and it should be. But I mean, failing that, there should be a place that can like, investigate and sort of like, reach resolution on like, individuals' complaints. And I think those organizations like, need to be trusted and sort of like, and and I think BBB like plays an important role in the program in providing that service to individuals. I mean, it's sort of analogous to like, in the EU, sort of individuals, um, can go to their data privacy authority to have
Mhm.
sort of an investigation done. It's quite similar to that. Um,
So there's one question that, and I encourage people, please do submit your questions. This one is probably timely to the point we're talking about right now, which is, and if I'm reading this correctly, I think the real question is, how does an organization become an IRM? Um, what is that process?
yeah, no, there is like, a process for that, and
How many IRMs do we have currently in the U.S.? Is it four? Five?
yeah, I think for right now. I mean, it's
Right.
definitely something that's sort of like, it's something that sort of has to be done, like, with a great deal of like, sort of uh, careful, like, this, like, and it's something
Mhm.
that sort of we like, and sort of like, the EU sort of like, have to sort of discuss, like, in the context of um, our annual reviews of the program, and it's definitely something where it has to be sort of like a trusted organization, and I think that there's I can sort of get back to you with sort of like, more on sort
Yeah,
of
no, absolutely,
around
absolutely. I
that.
think,
I'd actually
yeah,
have to go back and take a look at sort of the framework text to sort of identify like, what that process actually is.
yeah. So, just so attendees know, we will share the deck, which will include an appendix with resources, and we can include the information
Yeah,
um, on that specific question about how a company would become an IRM. And I will say, having operated one of BBB National Programs, overseeing one, um, having dedicated staff is important, right? Having the resources to stand up the IRM in light of all the obligations that are required of us, is not something that can be taken lightly. So I
Yeah.
think it's, a great level of scrutiny if it's your desire to become an IRM. Um, so we can go on to the next
Yeah.
slide. So I think as part of the IRM conversation, I think we should talk a little bit about dispute resolution and what that looks like, and what that is, what it looks like, how IRMs contribute to that process. So do you want to talk a little
Yes.
bit about
No,
it? Yeah.
definitely. So yeah, I think we spoke about this a little bit already, but sort of
Mhm.
the IRM is sort of very important to sort of yeah, having sort of this mechanism available to individuals to investigate and resolve complaints, um, and then also sort of monitoring sort of companies' participation in the framework and ensuring that they are sort of continuing to fulfill their requirements, of the DPF throughout sort of their certification year. And I guess that's one aspect I'd say that's also very valuable about sort of the IRM is that there's also I think and correct me if I'm wrong here, sort of a very valuable sort of back and forth and almost like sort of uh, helping companies understand their commitments and sort of what they need to be doing to comply.
Correct.
And it's almost like sort of a little bit sort of a mentoring relationship there, which I think can be
Mhm.
very helpful to
Mhm.
small and medium enterprises who are not sort of as familiar with sort of international data transfers and what their obligations are necessarily under this admittedly uh, complicated set of sort of obligations under the DPF as well as sort of foreign laws. Um,
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely true. I think in dealing with small and medium-sized companies, we're usually dealing with companies who don't have in-house counsel, outside counsel, who may not even have somebody on their team who really fully understands this. So we spend a lot of time talking to companies about what this all means, what their obligations are, not just in self-certifying, but their ongoing obligations to
yes.
maintain compliance, which I think is equally, if not more so important, right? It's one thing to get
Yeah.
certified, another thing to do the ongoing efforts with compliance. And as an IRM, one of the things that I think that's very important for what we do is really handling the consumer complaints, right? And oftentimes companies can get they can get bogged down with consumer complaints. They can also consumer complaints can also get lost in a system, right? And to be able to rely on an IRM and use our resources to respond to those things, to act as a mediator, right? To ensure that there isn't escalation, that we can resolve these things between the parties amicably, quickly, low cost, if no cost at all. So I think those are great things that the IRMs bring to the table under DPF.
Yeah, no, I think you definitely sort of made a very good point there about sort of why I know this is an important opportunity for companies because also many times I think you'll have sort of smaller companies who want to sign up for the DPF, but yeah, I mean, they don't have a lot of lawyers, or sometimes they don't even have a lawyer on staff. They don't have folks who are experienced with this type of compliance, and maybe they are able to sort of um, get through the process of self certifying. But yeah, I
Mhm.
mean, is there sort of the capacity there for sort of continued compliance after they've self certified? And I think having an IRM in place can really help with that, and also going to be sort of a help build sort of a privacy program. Um,
Right,
Absolutely,
absolutely. And I think as companies grow, their practices may change, right? And they still want to maintain your
yeah,
DPF certification. So again, having an IRN that you could talk with about the changes and growth that your company is going through, and how do you still maintain compliance. So again, I think the ongoing compliance and the work that we do with the companies, and as you know, we work with hundreds and hundreds of companies, um, of all sizes, and help them again maintain compliance as they decide to, shift and pivot their priorities, but want to maintain their businesses and their connections in the EU. So I think the services that IRM provides here are invaluable. And we talked about this earlier, the cost of doing business in the EU and under using DPF as a mechanism is key. Um,
Yeah,
in
I
light
mean, it's
of
definitely sort of
how
a
we
lot
do
more
this, right?
affordable
Right,
than putting in place standard contractual clauses.
right.
And also, it does provide sort of more of a framework for yeah, compliance in the long term. Because like
Mhm.
similarly, I mean, you can spend the money to have a law firm help you put in place sort of standard contractual clauses to cover your data transfers.
Right.
But then you're sort of at the end of that, you're like sitting there with how do I actually continue to comply with this? I put in place what are my obligations? How do I do this? How do I handle complaints in an appropriate fashion? And sort of, yeah, IRMs definitely sort of help with that and sort of provide sort of a more holistic
So I
approach.
got a couple of questions. Yeah. So one question that came through is, Alex, does the U.S. Department of Commerce um, does the U.S. Department of Commerce plan on using the DPF for other countries like Brazil, China that have other regulations regarding data privacy? I know the answer. I'm going to let you answer.
Yeah, I mean, right now, sort of, we're looking. I mean, the DPF is a fairly particular sort of framework, and it's definitely sort of very much focused on sort of the EU context, and so definitely sort of for countries that have sort of a historic sort of nexus with, like, I guess, the EU GDPR. So, I mean, the UK was previously subject to the GDPR and was previously sort of covered under the DPF, and now we've sort of put in place a mechanism to cover UK transfers, and Switzerland was traditionally covered as well. But we aren't looking right now at sort of expanding it to sort of other countries. But there are
Mhm.
sort of other options out there, and definitely I would sort of point folks to the uh, cross-border privacy rules, which is sort of a program that is also sort of the Commerce Department participates in, along with sort of a number of international partners that is looking at sort of trying to harmonize approaches to data transfers and provide sort of a similar um, way for companies to participate and sort of cover their data transfers. And we definitely provide additional information about that
Right.
um, that you can add in the slide deck to send out.
Okay. Okay. Another question, and I'm not sure I understand it, maybe you do, is can the Department of Commerce point EU IRM service providers to the right contact in the US to register, not an FTC DOT company, but as a supplier? So maybe you understand that better than
Oh, I
I
think
do.
that's like a variant on the question about how do you become an IRM.
Okay.
And I think, yeah, we'll provide sort of information on that sort of, yeah, and as a follow up.
Okay. Great. So I'm going to go to the next slide, which is our takeaways. And I think obviously the biggest takeaway that we're going to say here, both Alex and I, is advocate obviously for certifying to DPF. Um, be proactive, don't get penalized. As Alex said multiple times, this is an affordable way to become compliant under GDPR and ensure that your data transfers are compliant with the law. Sign up with an IRM today. Of course, I'm going to tell you to sign up with BBB National Programs and get started with the DPF program. Um, and I think we can take a look at kind of what, the value proposition here is. Obviously, DPF minimizes a certain level of risks. Um, and it signals to your company that you're practicing good compliance hygiene. And I don't think I can emphasize enough how increasingly important it is for businesses to display trust to their consumers. But we also know in an EU environment that it is explicitly important, right? That the ability for EU customers to understand not only can they trust your business to do the right thing and comply with their laws, but that you're actually going to address their complaints in a timely manner, that you're going to be responsive. And the only way that they have assurances of that is by you certifying to something like DPF. and that you can be held to the promises that you make in your privacy policies. For all intents and purposes, your privacy policy is a contract between you and your consumers. And companies really need to honor those contracts and those commitments. So I think the value proposition, I think, is very clear here. So I think there was another question. Um, okay.
Oh, and there's also like one question that sort of I think brings up the idea. It's asking sort of like I think more or less asking sort of like are there differences in sort of companies' obligations and how can they work with sort of their IRM or BBB
Hmm.
sort of make sure that what they're doing sort of under the DPF is
Hmm.
continues to be correct. I
Right.
mean, we've tried to make sort of the transition from the DPF from Privacy Shield to the DPF
Hmm.
as seamless as possible because we understand there's like a significant number of companies who continue to participate in Privacy Shield even after it was
That's right.
invalidated by the European Court of Justice, just because I mean they wanted to sort of maintain that assurance for their customers,
Hmm.
um, and
Right, and they could demonstrate that they were still adhering to
yeah,
something, right? They were still upholding some promise to something,
yeah,
and that they were holding themselves accountable. And by staying in our program and other IRM programs, you are still holding yourself accountable to an independent third party agency like us who could say, we're going to continue to check what you're doing and ensure that you're compliant.
yeah. And also, I mean, it's worth noting there that like I probably should have said this earlier, but the Schrems 2 decision that invalidated the Privacy Shield was solely focused on national security and
That's right.
government access to data, and
That's
did
right.
not sort of make any judgments or say that there was anything wrong with the commercial protections
That's
that
right.
Privacy Shield put in place. And so, really, companies who continue to participate in Privacy Shield were also demonstrating that they continue to sort of protect sort of individuals' data in the commercial context, and those were still complying with sort of the GDPR for those purposes, and that they're sort of
Right.
still implementing sort of best practices with regard to how they handle individuals' data and sort of what types of recourse they offer and sort of all of that, those important things, which, to be honest, is the most likely context in which an individual's data would be mishandled is in the commercial context. National
Hmm.
security is a very much an edge case, and sort of
Hmm.
for the vast majority of individuals, they are more likely to be um, subject to a data breach or have
Right.
their data sort of mishandled administratively than they are to be subject to surveillance that would inappropriately
Right,
target.
right. It's not as though there was an onslaught of consumer complaints that were not being responded to, that
Yes.
companies were just, ignoring EU consumers and not responding
Yeah.
to their needs or complaints. That was not happening.
No,
Uh,
and we have not heard anything about that. We have not had sort of any real complaints about sort of the protection that this offers in the
mhm,
commercial context. And
mhm.
that's been sort of reinforced in conversations with sort of our EU data privacy authorities, who, we talk to them and ask them, I mean, are there any issues that you have with this? Are there complaints that are not being addressed? Are there things that sort of we could be doing better? Yet, and we haven't sort of gotten any negative feedback in that regard. And so I
Right,
think that sort of individuals' data is being protected adequately in the commercial context. And
right.
now it's sort of like us bringing the DPF into force and that executive order that also allows us to demonstrate that we are protecting it adequately in the national security context as well. But that's sort of circling back, because we sort of got off on a tangent here, was that we made very intentionally, we did not sort of significantly change the commercial obligations.
Mhm.
And so basically, companies should not have to change their sort of operations or sort of what they are doing to transition from complying with their commitments under the privacy shield when they're shifting over to the data privacy framework. So yeah, companies should not have to change their sort of operations or sort
Right.
of and the main changes sort of in the that they would need to make in their privacy policy are changing the references to say data privacy framework, not privacy shield, and then also changing some references to refer to the GDPR because privacy shield was concluded under the 95 directive, And some companies, if they were referring directly to the relevant law, would be referring to the 95 directive rather than the GDPR, which was something else we updated.
So what does it mean to businesses when we say to them, you're grandfathered in from Privacy Shield to DPF? What does that really mean?
Well, it means that there was sort of like a period of time that sort of companies were able to sort of who were certified under Privacy Shield and maintain that certification. They got slightly longer, a few months longer, in order to update their certification to reflect the DPF.
Right.
But that is sort of past now, and so
Okay.
the company should be, yeah. And, but the thing is that sort of it's not sort of grandfathering, but I mean the fact that we and the Commission and the European Commission were very intentional about sort of making sure that nothing in sort of the data privacy framework
Correct.
principles changed companies' obligations.
Hmm.
So our goal here was to make it so that companies could sort of seamlessly transition over and would not
Correct.
need to change their um, operations. And so
Hmm.
we really made it so that the DPF principles are written in such a way that it doesn't sort of create new obligations for companies beyond what they were doing under Privacy Shield. But it does also introduces some new areas where you can, if you want, use the DPF to do things that you could not do under Privacy Shield. For
Hmm.
instance, the DPF includes key coded data, which is extremely important for the healthcare and life sciences field in
Hmm.
clinical trials. That was not covered previously under Privacy Shield, but we
Right.
were able to include that under DPF because um, it would not create sort of a new obligation for companies.
Hmm.
It just sort of provided an additional utility for them.
So I want to circle back to a question that I'm sure is on a lot of people's minds, and you mentioned it before when you mentioned Shrems. Um, there's obviously conversations about, will there be a Shrems 3? What is Commerce doing to prepare for any upcoming challenges to DPF, whether it's Shrems 3, whether it's, what's happening in the Irish court, what's happening in France? Um, what are some of the actions that Commerce is taking to ensure that this does
You
not
know,
go?
we're definitely sort of working very closely with sort of our colleagues in sort of the European Commission to, yeah, I mean, prepare for sort of future legal challenges, and we really are prepared to defend sort of the data privacy framework and address sort of and refute sort of any complaints about it. I mean, I think it's sort of we really did take sort of the Schrems 2 case and sort of the ruling in that as sort of a roadmap of what we needed to do and what points we needed to address in the data privacy framework and the executive order that underpins it. And so I think we addressed sort of the main points that could be that would be made in sort of a potential legal challenge. Certainly, I know Mr. Schrems, and then also, I mean, other individuals sort of are potentially bringing sort of legal challenges or could do so, and we're prepared to sort of address that. But I mean, the European Commission made its judgment on this in their adequacy decision and said that sort of they believe that sort of what the United States um, the commitments we have made fully address the concerns raised in the Schrems 2 decision and meet the standards
Mhm.
outlined in the General Data Protection Regulation. And so that I think is a important vote of confidence from our Commission colleagues.
Right.
And I don't think that the EU would have signed up for this if they thought that it was going to be sort of struck down. And so I think that we were prepared to work together to defend this and have a really good case to make. Um,
Right. It only benefits everybody, right?
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I mean, it's it doesn't just benefit sort of us. It's vital to both the US and the EU and sort of our
Right.
economic well being. And so I think this is something where it really wasn't an option for us
Mhm.
and sort of our European counterparts to not have the ability to transfer data freely. And also, I mean, it's like it brings into question sort of the um, broader transatlantic relationship. I mean, we are sort of the most trusted partners and strongest allies. And so definitely we should be able to transfer data and there should be a level of trust between us. And I think
Right.
that's reflected in the commitments the United States made here to
Mhm.
ensure that, um, yeah, we address the concerns raised in Europe.
Right. Can you give a bit of a status on the Swiss US data privacy framework?
Yes, I mean, we're sort of like, in discussions with Switzerland on that. I mean, it's sort of moving forward. It's, yeah, I don't anticipate sort of like there'll be like, I think we should be able to sort of bring it into force probably in the first quarter of this year. Um, and again, sort of like, as with the DPF and sort of the UK extension, there's going to be a great deal of commonality between this and sort of the Swiss US privacy shield. And so our goal here is to make sure that there is a minimal no disruption for companies who are yeah, transitioning over to it. And that if you're already complying with sort of the DPF, you
Hmm.
should be able to sort of bring the Swiss framework on with little to no changes.
Right, great. So, administrative question is how long is a company's certification valid, or actually, how long is Privacy Shield certification still valid? And I think we talked about this earlier that it's an annual application. They have to renew annually.
Yeah.
But I think we're still trying to figure out how long can they hold on to Privacy Shield. I think we said the window is closed now. Yes.
Yeah, I think by this point, like, companies should have like updated their privacy policies to reflect
Hmm.
the DPF,
Hmm.
um, and so and they should be able to like log into sort of the DPF website to check on that sort of like with their what their login was under the Privacy Shield website.
Right.
So you can use this. And this is actually something we had to deal with a lot. Was like, yeah, you can use the same credentials essentially.
Hmm.
I mean, it was sort of the same way that you logged into the Privacy Shield website. That's how you log in as well to the DPF website now.
Right. Right.
Um,
Great. So one last question before we close out is someone asked, is BBB National Programs a reliable IRM? And I'm going to do a quick pitch as to why we are a really good IRM. What sets us apart? Again, we're the oldest IRM provider, over 20 years of experience. My team is staffed by IAPP certified SIP professionals, and excuse me, and we have arbitration panelists or experienced attorneys, um, and we have a robust conciliation process. Dispute resolution is something that we do across programs at BBB National Programs, so this is not something that's specific just to DPF. So again, I would encourage you to reach out to us. We can talk in more detail about what we do and how we do it. I know we're at time, and this is just when my cough drop starts to expire. But Alex, thank you so much for your time today. Again, for those who attended, you will get the PDF, you will get the resources. If you have additional questions, please reach out to us. But Alex, thank you so much for your time. This was a great, valuable conversation.
no, thank you for having me, and definitely, yeah, huge thanks to BBB for hosting us here.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Good afternoon.